Thanks for having me. So yeah, I'm a graphic designer, and right now I'm at the New York Times. My title is visual editor, but it encompasses, I don't know, a myriad of things. I think, as a company, it's trying to create these kind of like more vibrant, hybrid roles. So on a day-to-day, I sometimes illustrate for like quick pieces that need to publish online. This role kind of like reflects the Times' transition into kind of like a digital first media company. My work is done completely in the digital space. I don't really touch the newspaper at all. So yeah, we have different types of stories on the desk. Some are funny, like this is a story about how a lot of kindergartens have gone vegan. And I made these little alphabets of vegan foods. And sometimes, we have stories that have more of a pop cultural edge to them, and this is a recent one about the money machine behind the Kardashian empire. Some stories are kind of neither poppy or silly on my desk, and kind of my job is to package them in, different ways using different visual tools I have at my disposal. Sometimes my job is kind of these larger interactives that require more solid, like a traditional design sensibility, like using grids, typography, white space, layout, that kind of stuff. And we would build this from scratch with kind of just basic code and a little bit of JavaScript for the interactions. This is a project launched almost exactly a year ago. Modern Love, which is a popular column on the newspaper, partnered with this gender desk at the newspaper to collaborate on this project called Sex and Consent on Campus. They asked college students how they're navigating sex on campus in the age of Me Too. And their reflections are kind of poignant and cringy and wishing to forget, but most of all, they needed to make sense of something that happened to them. And so this design, using kind of like a lot of ample white space and, gridded structures, and also separating the story into different kind of like narratives into 3 sections: anticipation, negotiation, and aftermath. You kind of feel like you're, experiencing one night, because these voices are sometimes talking about very similar things, and we kind of like grouped themes together to feel like, one big voice, even though it's like a myriad of different students' voices. Before my current job at the Times, I didn't design for the digital space at all. I worked at a business magazine called Bloomberg Business Week for 4.5 years. These are covers I made in 2013 when Snapchat just came out, and we were beginning to question what a disappearing internet might mean or look like. Outside my current job, I also take on freelance clients. This is a piece for Frank Ocean that he commissioned from me when he launched a little bit of new merch on his site. And I also, design for my own personal enjoyment. This is just like some titles I designed for a female director, a friend of mine. She directed a short film called Hannah's. And so yeah, this might give some of you like constricting blood vessels. This is I used to teach some classes here, and a big part of the curriculum, I think, is stuff like this, and the stuff that kind of most people think of when they talk about design, grid systems, branding guidelines, which are very important to know and to really grasp in the most like fundamental level, because in my own experience, whether I was designing for print or when I was designing for a live audience in a physical space, or designing for mobile or desktop audiences, I've encountered kind of like this mastery of like basic grid structures. As I said earlier, because this project's about making sense, I think the gridded structure was integral to kind of relaying that sensibility of trying to sift through the past and like make coherence out of it. I had the most rigorous training in grids when I worked at Business Week because we published one magazine per week, and there were a lot of cooks in the kitchen, a lot of collaboration, and if we didn't have, basic rules that we all followed, it would have been total chaos. Because of the rapid fire way that we had to put an issue together, every Thursday some 1 million copies would be kind of like distributed throughout the world. And, we basically only had like 3 or 4 days to work on an issue. And so it was important that like when we did the redesign, we had all these kind of like ready-made elements that we can kind of pick and plop depending on the content. Maybe you want to do a call out here and a call out there. By the time I'd left that job, I had made over 200 issues, and I think a clean layout's kind of like clean code. It like helps you collaborate with others better if your back-end structure makes sense, so that you can pass your work on to the next person that's taking it. So the rigorous grid system was part of the business model, right? Like if you have to waste time, figuring out what your colleague was trying to do without these kind of systems, you're wasting time and you're wasting kind of money. But I would say even with a rigorous grid, the workflow for print design, for the most part, or at least based on what I experienced for 5 years, it's still very manual. Like it's just production, grunt work most of the time. Like you're clicking and dragging little bits. Even if you've pre-made everything, you're copy and pasting little bits, manually flowing in text, manually making sure things line up. That your word counts are just so that they fit in like a little square. So a lot of your time is spent, doing this type of production work. The biggest takeaway from designing for the digital platform versus designing for the printed medium is the automation. Like on the web, we use design best practices to come up with a template, a set of instructions, and then, so everything I learned from working with a rigorous grid, I, would transfer to little freelance projects such as this. This is a website, an online magazine about blockchain technology. And so we knew that imagery around the world of blockchain would be crappy and really scarce. So the design specifically minimizes imagery and kind of relies on typography and sort of hierarchy to create a cohesive sensibility, at least. And, little bits and bobs were pre-made so that every time you have an article at the in the middle of it, you'll have like the top ranking stories, stuff like that. If this was in print, like this would be a template, but you'd have to go in and manually flow each line of text. So that's not very efficient. So the automation takes care of some tedious parts in a design, like the implementation of like a design manual, for example. But I would say that kind of stopped short there because, on top of the fact that good imagery we knew was going to be scarce, and then you can try and mitigate that by creating a template that uses small images sometimes. This freelance project the people who hired me to do this didn't have budget for a in-house art director. They had me design them a vessel, and I was happy to give them just that, a vessel. And I used my design sensibilities to give them a vessel. But when you're a magazine and you're in the business of publishing content, like what goes inside the vessel, like here, as you can see, like intelligent visuals was not part of their business model. And they end up with kind of like, I was gonna say hideous nightmares, but it's being recorded. It looks like a bot made this, or maybe like a creature from the deep sea that evolved beyond the need for eyes. I don't know, but like I don't know what made the editor think that like a dude's face would help make someone click on this story, or like that image on the right would help clarify whatever they're trying to talk about or help the reader understand the world. Contrast those images with these. These are kind of bespoke images made by my colleagues at the time at Business Week, Chris and Braulio. And that rigorous grid system that I talked about earlier, that all helped create an efficient workplace so that it carves out time for you to think about what you want to do in your kind of visual heavy moments. Like your type is going to look sick in this format, in this kind of template. So you have this kind of empty space. You make sure that you don't, slap just like a dude's face on it. And so, in this context, we were also making images in a context that was scarce and good images, but so we took care in crafting them, and we learned to rely on and kind of like refine every visual tool available to us, like collage, illustration, photo illustration, found imagery, metaphors, hyperbole, absurdism, kind of bespoke studio photography that you see on the right. I think that was shot by Caroline Tompkins, who's like this amazing photographer, but when she was working there, she would, help us create these kind of conceptual photography. She was, she would do in-house studio photography as well. So all in all, it forms like a visual voice that is like beyond just kind of grids and typography to create that sensibility. It has that visual voice for the content itself. And in my opinion, that's especially important right now because our media landscape is totally faceted. Like, there's constant dialogue and it's constantly evolving, and the audience is more apt in decoding visuals than ever. And, audiences engage with these like continued dialogues. This visual stands out for me because it's like the dumbest piece of interactive design ever conceived. It's a dog that you pet with your mouse or on your phone with touch. And it was part of this page we published on the New York Times on the day of the midterm elections, where we want to remind people that there is there are other things, like you can take a moment and pet this emotional support dog while you're stressed out about the midterm election. And people really liked it on the internet, and Neiman Lab compared it to the Times' 2016 election night needle. And people really kind of like expressed that they got the kind of joke, that they were in on, this dialogue that we're having with them. And I think we're successful in capturing a sentiment that a lot of people were feeling at the time, that they're nervous, they're so over this news cycle. And I think this project is kind of exemplary of what I look for in my work. I want to make my work playful and fun because that is just like a tool. Like I've found that like work that is playful and fun help you communicate a human quality. And ultimately what I want to is to use visuals to communicate and to relate, to help, articulate sentiments of our time a little bit. And honestly, like creating fun and intelligent visuals, like that helps us process feelings of right now, that's platform agnostic. Like it's important whether you're working in print or in digital mediums. And for me, it was born out of a necessity. The origins of the playfulness is somewhere here. When I was a teen, when I was 14, 15, 16, like my favorite after-school pastime was making websites, drawing, fan art, posting on blogs, posting on message boards. And as an adult, I don't think anything has changed. Except now people pay me to do it, and I have sold my favorite pastime forever to the Dark Lord. And I reduced my favorite pastime to, the banality of a 9-to-5 office desk job, essentially. So playfulness and making something funny and fun for myself, became a sort of coping mechanism during those Bloomberg Business Week years. Because working there meant making up endless ways to package stories about rich, old businessmen, like super wealthy men who all look quite similar. And like your job is to come up with creative ways to, make that interesting somehow. And so playfulness kind of like emerged for me as like a coping mechanism for the sheer monotony of covering the business world, kind of like a compensation. I hope that, you know, in the onslaught of old rich men stories, you and your coworkers can find ways to kind of humor yourselves. And we learn to think of creative ways to make a super boring task interesting or at least amusing for ourselves. We tried every creative avenue, like big, bold typography, a funny conceptual photo shoot that gets like a post-treatment, kind of visual pastiche for topics so impossibly dry, it kind of like makes your brain freeze, like the IRS, a stupid app on your phone, or like campaign finance. And I learned to use typography to create, you know, visual interests. It taught me that even in situations when the imagery isn't all that exciting, you can still use what you've got, just basic design principles like scale, white space, to create meaning. And because nobody's ever heard of the magazine, we almost never got like fancy photographers or artists to make stuff for us, and so instead we relied on scraps, like screenshots in this scenario, and we would like then dissect and recontextualize them. And it taught me not to be overly precious with imagery, and each week became a challenge for myself, like how do I make this super boring business story where, you know, like every magazine has access to the same photo shoot because Howard Stern refused to sit in on a photo shoot with us. How do I make that look a little bit more exciting? And I also learned to rely on words, you know, the power of kind of like language in combination with design to create something interesting. You know, this is a story about the new, at the time, like iPhone Force Touch feature, which is kind of like painfully non-visual. But we could have used an iPhone, but you know, a visual like this, kind of decidedly not a photograph, was kind of more evocative of a concept or idea. And you know, my editor at the time, who's Josh Tarangel, who wrote this article, like was a really good packager of concepts and ideas. And you know, I learned a lot from watching him use words the way that, you know, I might use something like scale or color or forms. So this is a story about how the Buffett Foundation donated millions of dollars to IUD initiatives. Not the most exciting stuff. And in this instance, and a lot of the times when I worked at the magazine, I wanted to create visuals that I could show a coworker and then they would be amused by it. I want to make them laugh. And I was the deputy design lead on that magazine at the time, and I'm proud of having helped create kind of like a warm office environment where we joked around a lot, and and this is important for me to reflect on because, you know, when you're having fun making something, it sort of shows in the work. There's a sort of kind of exuberant quality. This was my first glimpse into what that could look like. It was a special issue of the magazine called How To, and it asked experts on how to make stuff, like how to lie, how to save privacy, how to read lips. And this was in 2013. I was 24, and this still kind of feels really fresh in my mind. Like we created like a new kind of use of the grid. We had like different type sizes than how we normally would have laid out the issue. And we created all these kind of like blue seamless sets in-house. And I think our excitement of putting this issue together rubbed off on the guests we were featuring. Some of them we shot in-house in our own studio because, you know, the photos really showed that kind of excitement where normally they, you know, would just be completely not exciting to be photographed. And we did turn the art department into sort of like community theater. Here we played with the vernacular of kind of like business imagery and like the workplace. And for me, this is kind of like, it felt like an ultimate group effort where, you know, I was in charge of, security update. Where, you know, I was in charge of like the typography and the layouts, and some other person was in charge of building the sets and executing like a kind of a sketch in a photograph. So this kind of like set the tone for me quite early in my career. And so, you know, when you have fun making something, it's kind of like reflected in the design. It's kind of infectious. And I devised this visual identity for the magazine's annual design conference. It was a live event with over 500 attendees. The identity revolves around kind of like a Helvetica that's in motion when you interact with it. And we invite about 500 people, and usually they're like ultra serious business types, and they would kind of pay quite a bit of money to come here. And, you know, like I would design the sets and the displays that, you know, and I'm particularly proud of this year because I think it reflected a lot of the kind of like sensibility that we had as a group on the magazine. So like in 2016, like this really kind of like put our design ethos in display instead of kind of usual regular signage and kind of environmental design where like the restroom's this way, like on a little plaque. We had a series of kind of what we called human signage, which involved the designers of the magazine to live design this live event. We had a lot of dress rehearsals, and we kind of like brought that, you know, animation on the site to a real life stage, and we rehearsed all these kind of these little movements in our dress rehearsal. This is supposed to be evocative of that marquee that I guess has become extremely popular now. So yeah, like fun was like a core ethos of this particular art department, and we had turned it into a brand, and we brought it, you know, to an audience. And you know, at first they were extremely comprehensive of what we were doing, or apprehensive rather. And afterwards, you know, by the end of the day, they were kind of like laughing with us and kind of like asking us about what we're doing. And it's an ethos that I try to keep in mind. Even at the times, you know, in small ways, I try to make my coworkers laugh with this beautiful illustration of Lindsay Lohan. We had a story about how she has a really popular beach club in Greece, and she kind of canceled on her photo shoot at the 11th hour after we've sent a photographer all the way to Athens. And so people were kind of, you know, annoyed and kind of dispirited, and I just kind of like put this together rather quickly using a paparazzi photo to kind of like cheer everyone up, and it kind of worked. Like people were laughing at this, they were excited about this piece again. And I try to make my coworkers laugh with this. This was a story about a previous toxic male who declares he's no longer toxic, and he's trying to start a group that supports men too. You know, beyond humoring myself and my coworkers, you know, at Business Week, we also honed in on a different type of fun, and it's more kind of like cutting, more like closer to poking fun. And often what we're trying to poke at by way of visual language and kind of visual content is like the unequal distribution of power. You know, we're trying to ask, you know, at any given situation, who has it? Why do they have it? Are they doing something stupid with it? And at Business Week, it was kind of ripe for that kind of interrogation, because we cover stories about rich people, and they have power, and they get very creative with ways to keep that. There's something laughable in all their creative ways. And there's something funny about rich people's misfortunes, especially if it takes place at the Four Seasons Hotel in Hawaii. You know, some individuals have immense power. Well, they always have it, and even if they make mistakes. Big businesses have a lot of money and therefore a lot of power. Do they misuse it? And some companies have a lot of power at one time, and then they eventually lose it all. And there's something really funny about that too. This is a cover story about Yahoo when it was being kind of sold for parts, and we were trying to make fun of how, you know, this once powerful company is kind of now getting rid of their CEO, but we kind of hit the punchline in just kind of this, in these kind of little tearaways, which has like a fake Marissa Mayer email. We designed this using like only system fonts. I tried at one point to use kind of our magazine's more specialized, beautiful commercial type fonts, and it just kind of was a little flat. Like it didn't have that kind of irony that we were trying to get at. So yeah, you know, like being baffled at power with visual language, that's something I think about a lot. And you know, I think this relationship is only afforded in editorial design. You know, after I left Bloomberg, I meandered a bit. I worked at places that are, you know, not places where you can kind of like hold those who abuse their power accountable. I found myself at Google. It's kind of like mandatory, playful environment kind of really made me want to die. And it wasn't just the environment. Like the work I made for them just wasn't fruitful for me, and I couldn't really nail the exact reason at the time. You know, some of the more enjoyable work I made for them are these kind of like selfie, like prototypes, like kind of selfie filters for kind of expressions like hello or bye, or like, oh my God, bye, and you get ejected. Or you're super awkward and you're trying to fade into the hedges. These are all available to you, by the way, if you want to make this GIF. You can use Google Allo to make them. And of course, these are very, you know, playful if we're talking about like fun and playfulness. But, you know, the joy I derived from making these were kind of different in quality than, you know, having made like a cover or something for Business Week. And because I felt like I was kind of making little phone toys for adult babies. And I just really had a hard time with that. And, you know, although similar in energy, like this identity I created for Amanda Hess's video series called Interneting, where she kind of dissects common memes and, you know, our internet culture, our obsession with certain themes on the internet. You know, like common threads, like why all of a sudden are there kind of like a lot of hand videos? What does that mean for us and our brains? And I feel like these were weightier because they were backed by Amanda Hess's like quite intelligent essays on internet culture. And, you know, like for me, this project, which was about the royal wedding last year between Meghan and Harry, which was displayed in this kind of giant FAQ, packed with kind of really dumb stuff in these drawers every time you click on a question. You know, this plays with the form of, you know, like all these wedding FAQs. If you have friends who are getting married, there's always like a frequently asked question on their site. So this was meaningful. This is a meaningful project for me because it has like a double-edgedness, you know. At first it can seem as kind of like a playful, exuberant, like celebration of matrimony. But for me, it was almost a lot about like dumbness. It's about, you know, this giant and totally confounding public spectacle, you know, baffling for its contradictions because it doesn't really add up when you start to dissect it. Meghan's not especially, you know, special, and yet, you know, we're obsessed. And, you know, as a society, we think absolute power is very, very bad. But the British monarchy is like, okay now. And, you know, as a newspaper, we're constantly, you know, talking about the shifts in how we talk about marriage, you know, how the traditional concept of marriage is changing. And yet, you know, here we are completely, you know, infantilized by this very public mass spectacle of a wedding. And I kind of wanted to design like a thing that sort of gets at the question of like, why are we like this? why do we allow ourselves to be infantilized by the internet? Why does the internet infantilize us? And why are we basic? And why are we hooked? Every click gives me, a little treat, and I want to click more and more. And yeah, I just kind of want to get at that a little bit with this project. I want my designs to be fun and have bite, of course, but I also want it to serve as a way to discuss certain, feelings and realities of being adult on the internet right now. An adult who's kind of engaging with the world, and I'm happy to be working at the Times, which allows me to do that. So that's the end.